Our May I-bond rate projection. Did we crack the code on the fixed rate? Hello, members and super savers. I hope you're healthy and well. Today's video is the I-bond update video with our May I-bond rate projection that many of you have been asking and waiting for. As you can see from this recent community poll on which video would you rather watch first from us. But first, I want to give a big thank you to each and every one of you who voted for their preferred topic, and also for your patience as we sort through all the video requests that have come in over the past several months. So, these are the 3 topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. The May I-bond fixed rate projection. This is a must-watch for anyone who owns I-bonds or who's thinking about adding I-bonds to their portfolio, as we think we may finally have cracked the code on how the Treasury sets the fixed rate. 2. The May I-bond inflation rate. And 3. Our current I-bond plans. As usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. As many of our I-bond fans have heard me say before, the I-bond fixed rate is what many of us long-term investors look at first, because it tells us I-bond investors how much ahead of inflation we will be. So for example, this current I-bond fixed rate of 1.30%, that's valid for all I-bonds issued between November 1st, 2023 and April 30th, 2024. An investor who purchases these I-bonds will always stay 1.3% ahead of inflation. And like many of you have also heard me say before, the I-bond fixed rate is essentially like the real yield on TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities, conceptually, because the real yield on TIPS also tells a TIPS investor how much ahead of inflation they are. And if you need a refresher or primer about the difference between nominal and real yields and how I-bonds and TIPS work, we explain all this in our brand new Bond Beginners and Bond Masters courses that we've been working on for the past few months. I'll talk more about them towards the end of this video, but you can also find the link below this video if you want more details. So, back to the I-bond fixed rate and how it relates to the real yield on TIPS. And indeed, if we look at the data from this chart here, the I-bond fixed rate, this blue line here, does pretty much track the real yield on TIPS, these green and yellow lines here, and usually with a bit of time lag. When the real yields on TIPS go up, so does the I-bond fixed rate. And when the real yields on TIPS go down, so does the I-bond fixed rate. Now, based on our understanding, no one really seemed to know exactly how the Treasury sets the fixed rate on I-bonds. One of our team members, though, did bring to my attention a recent article from David Enna of Tips Watch, where he suggested taking 65% of the average daily real yield on the 5-year or the 10-year TIPS for the 6-month period before the I-bond rate reset date to come up with the prediction for the next I-bond fixed rate. And that's what we used as our starting point for our I-bond fixed rate analysis. And as usual, we decided to take our numbers a few steps further, all the way back to 2003. So more than 2 decades. That's why you see this 1 of 2 here. But more on those historical numbers later on. Let's talk about the here and now first. This column shows the I-bond rate reset dates between November 1st, 2023 and November 1st, 2019, and the corresponding I-bond fixed rate for those periods. These columns show the annualized average daily real yield for the 6 months prior to the I-bond rate reset dates listed here for the 5-year TIPS, the 10-year TIPS, and the 30-year TIPS. And for the lifelong learners amongst us, we took all 3 of these TIPS maturities in our initial analysis because a case can be made for using any of these 3 maturities as the reference point for calculating the I-bond fixed rate. There's a case to be made for the 5-year TIPS as the point of reference because of the fact that the early withdrawal penalty on I-bonds is applicable in the first 5 years of purchase. And perhaps historically, I-bond holders who did redeem their I-bonds tended to do so after the early withdrawal penalty no longer applied, so after 5 years. And also for the simpler reason that under normal circumstances, the real yield on the 5-year tips is typically lower than that on the 10-year tips and the 30-year tips due to its shorter time to maturity, meaning that using the real yield on 5-year tips as the reference point for the I-bond fixed rate would more often than not lead to lower overall borrowing costs for the Treasury. Having said that, you could also argue for the 10-year tips because the 10-year T-note is the benchmark in the industry, which as our Bond Beginners and Bond Masters course folks know, and which you also now know, means that the 10-year Treasury note forms the basis for how many other fixed income products, including mortgages, are priced. And finally, the 30-year tips. It also has at least one good argument on its side because, well, all I-bonds have a 30-year term. So with that background, here's what the average daily real yield for 5-year tips looked like for the 6 months prior to these I-bond rate reset dates. Here's what the average daily real yield for the 10-year tips over that same period looked like. And here's what the average daily real yield for the 30-year tips over that same period looked like. Now, let's take 65% of the average daily real yields from these 3 columns, meaning multiply these average daily real yields here by 0.65 and put them in these 3 columns. Here's what the 65% adjustment looks like for the 5-year tips, the 10-year tips, and the 30-year tips. If you're so inclined, pause the video now and leave a comment below. What does this table show us? And then unpause the video and keep watching to see if we came to the same conclusion. Now, regardless of whether you just pause the video for a few seconds or not, let me tell you what I think this table shows us. And here it comes, another long-standing mystery of the financial world solved right before your eyes on Diamond NestEgg. The 65% of the average daily real yield on the 5-year tips for the 6 months prior to the I-bond rate reset date gets us closest to the fixed rate that is then announced by the Treasury. You could even say it gets us there exactly if we keep 2 points in mind. First, the Treasury always seems to round the fixed rate on I-bonds to the next full 10 basis points, the next full tenths of a percent. And second, remember that the fixed rate on I-bonds will never go negative, unlike the real yield on tips that can and does go negative under certain circumstances. And this means that when the outcome is negative here for the 5-year tips, the I-bond fixed rate is simply set at 0 by the Treasury. So the reference point for the I-bond fixed rate appears to be the 5-year tips alone, not the 10-year tips or the 30-year tips. Let's now go to page 2 of this table to test out our assumptions for a few more years back. And we see the analysis plays out here just as before for most of the I-bond rate reset dates from May 1st, 2019 back to November 1st, 2014. And just like for the first table, 65% of the average daily real yield on the 5-year tips for the 6 months prior to the I-bond rate reset date gets us closest to the fixed rate that is then announced by the Treasury, with rounding as described earlier. And when the outcome is negative here for the 5-year tips, the I-bond fixed rate is then always set at 0 by the Treasury. Now, there is one exception to the rule, being this fixed rate here on May 1st, 2015, where the I-bond fixed rate should have been set to 0.10% rather than 0%, if we were to apply the same thought process as before. So in this case, we would have expected that this 0.06% here would have been rounded up to 0.10% instead of rounded down to the flat 0% you can see here. Let's set this exception to the side momentarily, though. We will get back to it. For now, let's go back to page 1 of our I-bond fixed rate analysis. I'm sure many of you noticed this empty row up here. Let's fill out this row now. As of April 4th, 2024, here's what the average daily real yields look like since the last I-bond rate reset date. And here's what the numbers look like when we multiply them by 65%, meaning that based on our analysis, the projected I-bond fixed rate for the May 1st, 2024 reset should be 1.2%. That's this 1.24% here for the 65% of the 5-year TIPS real yield, rounded down to the next full 0.1%. Now, there is one thing you need to remember about this projected I-bond fixed rate. It is a projection. We ran this analysis in many different ways and tested a lot of variables. And it seems as valid as it can be according to our best knowledge and judgment. But it's still just a projection. And of course, the Treasury could tinker with what we think the formula is at any time they wish. Or maybe they follow a completely different thought process. Because as we can read here, it's ultimately the Treasury that determines the fixed rate of return for I-bonds. Back to our analysis though. As you may recall, I had mentioned earlier that we ran the numbers as far back as 2003. And these two tables go only as far back as the I-bond rate reset date on November 1st, 2014. You should know that in the years between 2003 and 2014, this 65% number did not always work. Sometimes the percentage was closer to 30%, and sometimes even less. That said, it seems that our formula has been working well and without an exception for the past 8 years, since the November 2015 I-bond rate reset. And given that we don't have any further details on the Treasury's decision-making process on this matter, we'll stick with this 1.2% I-bond fixed rate projection for May 1st as our best guess at this point in time. Now, let's move on to the I-bond inflation rate, or variable rate, next. As our I-bond fans know, the variable rate on I-bonds mirrors the inflation rate. So by tracking the inflation rate, we know what the variable rate on our I-bonds will be. Both rates are the same. I'll be using the term I-bond inflation rate when referring to the variable rate, because inflation rate seems to be the term that Treasury Direct has adopted on its website when describing the variable rate that changes every 6 months on May 1st and November 1st. Here's what we have so far on our May 2024 I-bond inflation rate tracking sheet. The CPIU all items number at the end of September 2023 is the starting point for the May 2024 I-bond inflation rate calculation. And currently, we already have 5 out of the 6 months of data that we need to complete the calculation. Here are the inflation numbers for October 2023. Here are the ones for November 2023. And here are the ones for December 2023. And here we have the ones for January 2024, as well as the ones for February 2024. The inflation numbers for March 2024 will be available on April 10th. But what we have so far brings us to an actual 5-month change in CPIU for all items of 0.82%. So, while it's possible that on April 10th, we'll find out that there was no price movement at all in March inflation numbers, let's do what we always do and see what the projected March 2024 CPIU number could look like. If we assume that March inflation increased at the same rate as the average monthly increase in inflation between September 2023 through to February 2024, we get to a projected March 2024 CPIU number of 310.836 and a projected 6-month percentage change of 0.99%. Multiply this by 2, and this translates into a projected annualized I-bond inflation rate of 1.98% for May 2024. if we assume that March inflation increased at the same rate as the average monthly increase in inflation for the preceding 5 months. But here's the thing. Is the average monthly increase in inflation between September 2023 through to February 2024 really such a good proxy? Or would it be better to take the average monthly increase in inflation in January and February 2024 only as our proxy, given general seasonality factors? As you can see, there has clearly been a noticeable pickup in monthly inflation in January and February of this year. You could even call it a potential trend reversal after the negative monthly readings in the last quarter of 2023. No one really knows, right? So let's run a scenario for projected March 2024 CPIU using just the average monthly increase in inflation in January and February 2024 only. If we do this, then the projected March 2024 CPIU jumps to 312.132, and the projected 6-month percentage change goes up to 1.41%. Multiply this by 2, and this translates into a projected annualized I-bond inflation rate of 2.82% for May 2024. Again, if we assume that March inflation increased at the same rate as the average monthly increase in inflation in the first 2 months of 2024 only. If we take our two scenarios as the endpoints of a possible range of outcomes, we get to an expected annualized I-bond inflation rate of somewhere between 1.98% to 2.82% for the May 2024 I-bond rate reset. What we can see from this exercise is that regardless of whether we assume that March inflation increased at the same rate as the average monthly increase in inflation over the past 5 months, as we do here, or if we assume that March inflation increased at the higher average monthly rate that we saw in the first 2 months of 2024, as we do here, the I-bond inflation rate for May 2024 will likely be lower than the current annualized I-bond inflation rate of 3.94%. Of course, anything can happen, and let's see what the reaction in our community will be to that lower inflation rate, if it really comes through as expected. In any case, I'll report back with an update after this next round of inflation numbers is released on April 10th, which is a nice segue into the next section of our video. So if we take our projected I-bond fixed rate of 1.2% here, with the expected annualized I-bond inflation rate of somewhere between 1.98% to 2.82% for May 2024, depending on how optimistic or not you are about where inflation is headed, we get to projected annualized I-bond total, or combined rate of 3.19% to 4.04%, including the bump, the inflation adjustment on the fixed rate. This doesn't sound like it's mind-blowing, especially if you don't care about inflation protection in your fixed income portfolio. There are certainly treasuries and other types of bonds out there with higher yields that you may want to consider if protecting your bond investments against inflation is not a top priority. However, if you still have fresh memories of the inflation spikes in 2022 and 2023, and if you do care about inflation protection in your fixed income portfolio, which in my mind you should, especially if you're getting close to or are already in retirement, then you should know that if our projected I-bond fixed rate of 1.2% comes to fruition on May 1st, it will still be the second highest I-bond fixed rate in over 16 years, with the highest one being the current 1.3% I-bond fixed rate for all I-bonds issued on or before April 30th. As many of you know from our last I-bond video, we are redeeming all our 0% fixed rate I-bonds. Marcus and I will purchase $10,000 each toward the end of April to grab the current 1.3% I-bond fixed rate. As the old adage goes, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And if it turns out that the I bond fixed rate on May 1st stays at 1.3% or perhaps goes even higher, then we'll just gift one another some I bonds for delivery in a year when we don't purchase our annual limit of I bonds. What about you? What are your I bond plans? Buy in April or wait for May? Drop a comment below and let everyone know. Now, as our community knows, we are committed I bond fans, especially when used as an inflation-protected emergency fund. And as I just explained, we will be picking up more I bonds in April. That said, where things are really interesting in the world of fixed income and inflation protection right now is actually TIPS. As some of you know, we recently purchased these 30-year TIPS at this record-setting auction yield of 2.2%. And as you may recall from this earlier chart and our formula, when TIPS yields are positive, they are generally higher than the I bond fixed rate. We'll be talking quite a bit more about TIPS on the channel while those yields are attractive. However, TIPS are a bit more complex than I bonds. And as our Bond Beginners course folks hear me say often, while there are some similarities between TIPS and I bonds are in some respects more different than they are similar in my mind. Stay tuned for our upcoming TIPS versus I bonds video, taken directly from our newly launching Bond Beginners course, so that you can get a sneak peek of what we've been working on since December of last year. Also, TIPS versus I bonds was the second most requested video in this poll that many of you took part in. The winner from this poll, though, is actually bond laddering in times of uncertainty, as you can see here. And that is the one that we'll be sharing with you next in the coming days. This time, taken directly from our intermediate level Bond Masters course. If you want to jumpstart your fixed income knowledge sooner rather than later, and want to join the Bond Masters live online course session that's happening on Tuesday, April 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, then check out the 15% coupon code below this video and get started immediately. On that note, members and super savers, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And see you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.